Today we are going to look at a case from the end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Helen Potts was born in New Jersey in 1871. She came from a very middle-class family and was the eldest of her parents' two children. At the time of her birth, the USA was experiencing an economic boom. The years following the end of the Civil War saw many factories being built, and people started to move from the rural towns and villages to set up home in the larger, more urban areas. As the railroads expanded, many previously remote parts of the country became more accessible. This industrial growth transformed American society, along with the new class of wealthy industrialists. The number of middle-class families increased. Immigration also continued, and there were more opportunities for the young. This was an exciting time for the country, and by 1889, when Helen was a young woman, the United States had developed into the world's most productive economy, with its industry producing twice as much as its closest competitor, which at the time was Great Britain. When she was 18 years old, Helen met a young gentleman called Carlisle Harris. He was 2 years older than her, having been born in September 1869. He came from the small city of Glen Wells in Warren County, New York, and in the summer of 1889, his father had taken a property by the sea in the town of Ocean Grove in New Jersey. Like Helen, Carlisle was one of two children and came from a respectable family. However, his father had not been able to provide his children with an upbringing as privileged as Helen's. She was indulged by her parents and was especially spoiled by her mother, while Carlisle had worked from a young age in order to help his parents, even though he had always continued to study. When he met Miss Helen Potts, he had just finished his first year at the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, a prestigious institution where he studied medicine. They soon started to spend much time in each other's company and seemed to be very fond of each other. Miss Potts portrayed herself as sweet and innocent, and as someone who possessed all the virtues and good graces associated with young ladies in the latter part of the 19th century. However, she had previously been engaged to a young gentleman named Mr. Harry Brown. The engagement did not last very long. Helen's mother claimed that her daughter had grown tired of the young man and ended the relationship. But the family of Mr. Brown later claimed that it was in fact he who broke off the engagement. When the summer ended, Carlisle returned to university, but he continued to see Helen. He would often return to Ocean Grove to see her. Helen's mother, Mrs. Cynthia Potts, was always pleased to see the smart young gentleman who was studying to be a doctor, but after a while, she became concerned. She had previously felt that her daughter was too young to be engaged, and as Mr. Carlisle Harris' visits continued, she could see that Helen was very taken with him. When Helen told her mother that she wanted to get engaged for the second time, Mrs. Potts advised her to wait. However, the couple continued to see each other as often as they were able. Carlisle asked Helen if she would like to visit the stock exchange. They would be accompanied by Carlisle's younger brother, Mr. Macready Harris. Although Mrs. Cynthia Potts was not in favour of her daughter spending time alone with a young man, as they would be accompanied by Mr. Macready Harris, she agreed that Helen may be allowed to go. So on the 8th of February 1890, Helen boarded a train and travelled to New York. Helen had no intention of visiting the stock exchange, and Carlisle had not even told his brother that Helen was coming to visit him. Soon after arriving, the couple set off to City Hall, where they were married. Miss Helen Potts was now Mrs. Helen Harris. Strangely, when giving their details to the alderman, they did not use their real names. Carlisle registered himself under the name Charles Harris, while Helen used the name Miss Helen Nielsen, Nielsen being her middle name. They also decided to keep their marriage a secret. Carlisle was very anxious to improve his circumstances, but studying to become a doctor took up most of his time. In the summer of 1890, he borrowed $600 from his grandmother and opened a cafe in Asbury Park. He thought that he'd be able to make a lot of money, and told Helen that if this happened, they'd be able to let everyone know that they had married in secret the previous February. His cafe did well, and was noticed by a local business that had set up in 1889 called the Neptune Club. The owners agreed to take the second floor of the building where the cafe was located. They told Carlisle that they would pay him a good rental and guarantee that his cafe, which was situated on the first floor, would improve its takings by $100 a month. Of course, Carlisle agreed. He He was determined to make the money and acknowledge his marriage to Helen. At least, that's what he told her, as since they had married on the 8th of February, he had visited Helen far less often than before. And even though Helen's mother was not aware that her daughter had married Mr. Carlisle Harris, she could see how upset Helen was each time that the young gentleman had promised to visit her, only to send word that he was unable to make the trip. But the fact that Carlisle had been busy in his cafe wasn't the only reason that Helen was feeling distressed, as in June of 1890, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Although Carlisle had forbade her from telling anyone about their secret marriage, Helen decided to tell her friend, Miss May Schofield. She also told her about her pregnancy. A termination was illegal in virtually all of the country at the time, although some states did permit one, if it was considered necessary in order to save the life of the mother. There was, however, much stigma that surrounded anyone who had been rumoured to have had an illegal termination, and the establishments that offered them were usually backstreet clinics, where the procedure was often carried out by unskilled physicians. While Helen was married, the marriage to Carlisle Harris had been kept secret, and her husband persuaded her that it would be best if she terminated the pregnancy, an operation that he himself would perform. But this was not something with which he was familiar. Nevertheless, he undertook the procedure, and although he killed the fetus, he neglected to remove it. Over the next few days, Helen started to feel extremely poorly. When she realised that she was only getting worse, she confided in her uncle, a gentleman named Dr. Treverton, who lived in the city of Scranton in Pennsylvania. He was most concerned about the health of his niece and performed a second operation to remove the fetus. Dr. Treverton kept her under his care for a month, and during this time he remained in constant contact with Helen's mother, Mrs. Cynthia Potts. He also demanded that Carlisle Harris come and help look after Helen. Carlisle did indeed visit his wife in Scranton, and while there, found his way to the local tavern, where he got into a discussion with Dr. Treverton's stable boy, a teenager named Oliver. Carlisle told him of how he was able to seduce any young lady he so desired. He said that he always took them out and gave them alcohol, but if that did not work, he would ask them to marry him. If they still refused to give up their virtue, he would then marry them. He boasted that Helen had not been the first young lady he had married. When Dr. Treverton heard about this, he was infuriated. He could not believe that a young man who was studying to become a doctor could act in such an outrageous manner. He informed Mrs. Potts about her daughter's condition and that she had secretly married Mr. Carlisle Harris. He also considered informing the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons about the scandalous behaviour of one of their students, but in the knowledge that this may lead to the relationship being exposed and the Potts family subjected to ridicule and scandal, he decided that he would not take the matter any further. However, Carlisle's problems were compounded when his decision to lease the first floor of the building he used for his cafe to the Neptune Club proved to be disastrous. The club had started to sell alcohol from the premises, which was illegal to do from that specific location, and this resulted in his arrest. He then spent the night locked up in a police station before his grandmother paid for his bail, and he still had to explain himself to Helen's mother. Mrs. Potts was very disappointed with the behaviour of both Mr. Harris and her daughter, but she was more concerned for Helen's health. She confronted Mr. Harris and told him that it was her opinion that the couple should marry in church straight away in order to end the secrecy surrounding the relationship. However, Mr. Harris told her that they should wait until he had finished his studies. Eventually, it was agreed that the couple would marry on the 8th of February 1891, exactly 1 year to the day that they had actually married in New York. This was certainly not the way Mrs. Potts had imagined her daughter would marry, but she was anxious to avoid a scandal that would bring shame onto her family. Carlisle suggested that Helen be sent to a finishing school. This would mean that she would be away from Ocean Grove and any unwanted questions from inquisitive neighbours. It would also benefit her, as she would learn social graces and etiquette in preparation for her entry into society. Mrs. Potts agreed and arranged for Helen to attend Miss Comstock's finishing school in New York City. Helen proved to be a popular student at the school. She was a little older than most of the other young ladies, but everyone considered her to be kind and courteous. She was still not well. Not only was she suffering from the physical and psychological effects of her ordeal, she also complained of headaches and had trouble sleeping. In order to try and resolve her problems, she asked Carlisle if he'd be able to prescribe something to help her sleep. Of course he obliged, and made up a mixture of 25 grains of sulfite of quinine and 1 grain of sulfite of morphine. He then asked for medical school pharmacists to place the mixture into 6 capsules. This meant that each capsule would only contain 1/6 of a grain of morphine. He showed the capsules to Helen and gave her 4 of them, keeping the other 2 on his person. She was to take 1 each night before she went to bed. Helen spent the day of Saturday, the 31st of January 1891 with her mother. They discussed the wedding, which would take place the following week, and Mrs. Potts told her to rest. She was still concerned about her daughter's health. That night, Helen started to feel unwell. Her roommates had gone to a concert, and when they returned, Helen was making strange noises. She told them of the strange dreams she was having. The other girls told her to go back to sleep. They said she needed to rest, but Helen was afraid. She said that if she went to sleep, she may never wake up again. The girls decided to fetch the principal, who realised that there was something not quite right about Miss Helen Potts. She was having trouble breathing, and her complexion had gone decidedly pale. The principal immediately sent for the doctor, a gentleman named Dr. Fowler. He arrived with an assistant named Dr. Banner, and together they examined Helen. By now her condition had deteriorated. A third doctor, named Dr. Kerr, was sent for, but despite the best efforts of 3 doctors, at 11 o'clock in the morning of Sunday the 1st of February, Miss Helen Potts died. The doctors discussed a possible cause of death, and Dr. Fowler said that he believed that the young lady had died due to taking in excessive amounts of morphine. He looked around near the bed to see if he could find anything that may contain morphine. He searched in the drawers and on the shelves before he stumbled across a box with a label on it, which was written 1 before retiring and was signed CWH, student. Dr. Fowler asked who this may be, to which Helen's roommates replied that it was a young gentleman who had on occasions called upon Helen. They said that his name was Mr. Carlisle W. Harris, and that he studied medicine at the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Fowler sent word that the young gentleman should come immediately to Miss Comstock's finishing school. Carlisle soon arrived to the school on West 14th Street. He was escorted upstairs, where he saw his young wife lying dead. His first reaction was to ask Dr. Fowler if he may be held responsible for the death. He then went on to tell him about how Helen had been suffering from headaches and insomnia, and that he had asked a pharmacist to make up the capsules that contained 25 grains of sulfate of quinine and 1/6 grain of morphine. He gave Dr. Fowler the 2 capsules that he had on his person. Helen's mother, Mrs. Cynthia Potts, was informed of her daughter's passing and made her way to New York. The coroner requested that he may perform an autopsy, but Mrs. Potts refused this request. She told him that her daughter had always suffered from a weakness of the heart, and that she wanted to take the body home so it may be prepared for burial. Dr. Fowler sent the 2 remaining capsules to be examined, and both contained the exact amount of morphine, as Carlisle Harris had claimed, and was not enough to cause a patient to die. However, something seemed very strange about the death of young Miss Helen Potts. Newspapers had reported on what had happened at Miss Comstock's finishing school, and as weeks passed, some had started to question if this was indeed a simple case of a young woman who had died of a weak heart. They wondered if something more sinister had taken place. Headlines which stated, "Was this murder?" appeared in the press, and on the 21st of March, one paper published a story detailing the secret marriage between Helen Potts and Carlisle Harris. 2 days later, in an attempt to stop any speculation, the body of Miss Helen Potts was exhumed and an autopsy was conducted, the results of which showed large amounts of morphine in Helen's stomach. Carlisle Harris was then arrested and charged with murder. His trial began the following year, on the 19th of January 1892, and Carlisle pleaded not guilty. He was represented by the eminent lawyer, Mr. William Howe, and the prosecution was led by the Assistant District Attorney, Mr. Charles Sims Jr. The public seemed to be very excited by the case, and the newspapers filled their pages with the events that were happening in courts. Rumours had already started amongst the New York public that the defendant was a womanizer who had married at least 3 times, and on each occasion to a very decent young lady who had told Mr. Carlisle Harris that they would not be alone with him until they were married. He was now considered to be a very devious and dangerous character. The prosecution told the court of a defendant's dubious history with young women. They also proposed that of the 6 capsules that he had made up at the medical college pharmacist, he had added to one up to 5 grains of morphine. He then gave Helen 4 of the capsules, in knowledge that in the following days, one of the capsules she ingested would prove to be fatal. The prosecution believed that he had hoped that Helen would have taken the capsule with the lethal dose on one of the first 2 days, as if the remaining capsules were found, it would prove that there was only 1/6 grain of morphine in them, and that he in fact had given her nothing more than medication to help her with her headaches and insomnia. The prosecution believed that it was for this reason that Carlyle had kept 2 capsules on his person. The prosecution added that in the days prior to the defendant giving Miss Potts the capsules, he had attended a lecture at the college, which had been based on morphine and its effects. Following this, the students had unsupervised access to the drug from a large bottle of morphine which had been shown to them. If Carlyle had indeed obtained the morphine from the bottle, no one would have known, and it would have been very easy for him to have done so. Dr. Alan Hamilton and Professor Rudolf Wittus, who had conducted the autopsy, were presented as witnesses. Both testified that the autopsy results clearly showed that the unfortunate young lady had died as a result of ingesting a large amount of morphine. Carlyle did not take the stand in his own defence. This very much surprised the journalists who were reporting on the case, and very much disappointed the public, who had been anxious to read about the young man's version of events, which had led to the death of his secret wife. The trial ended on the 2nd of February 1892, and the jury only deliberated for 1 hour and 20 minutes before returning with a verdict of guilty. The judge then sentenced the defendant, Mr. Carlyle Harris, to death. The defence appealed the verdict, but it was upheld. Following this, they filed affidavits, claiming to have new evidence in the case, but this was also denied. This was then followed by an application to the New York governor to have the sentence commuted, but after careful consideration, the governor also denied the request. Carlyle Harris always protested his innocence. He claimed his wife had taken morphine of her own volition, and that she had unfortunately taken too much, which had led to her death. He claimed to have been found guilty by libel and innuendo in the columns of the press, rather than by means of witnesses in the courts. On the 8th of May 1893, he was sent to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. His mother never believed her son to be guilty, and on his tombstone it is written, "Murdered by 12 men, if the jury had only known." Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.